Amen. I can't believe it's been a year since the vote last year. Yeah, thanks. Thanks. Time really flies when you're having fun. Let me just begin with a word of prayer. Father, as we look into your word right now, I'm overwhelmed with the depth and the amount of treasure to find. Help us, Lord, to find treasure this morning. Help us to dig deeply in the midst of covering so much material. I just pray that your Spirit would be present, challenging, convicting, transforming me and everyone else here as well. We just pray, Lord, collectively together in Jesus' name. Amen. So we continue going through the Gospel of Mark. This is now the 17th sermon, and we're just hitting chapter 8. So we're rolling slowly right along. We started by talking about this whole idea of what exactly is the gospel. We've watered it down. We've turned it into just good news, but it's so much more than that. When the term good news, evangelion, when the term good news was being used in Rome at the time of Christ, it was a victory term. It was a cheer of victory when a new emperor, a new leader would take over. That leader would send messengers out to the whole area of the kingdom announcing good news. There's a new victor. The old person that was in charge has been disarmed. There's a new victor. The victor is coming. This is an announcement to say, make your affairs in order, align with the new king, or suffer the consequences. That's the military term that good news meant. That's what Jesus usurped. That's what he subverted. That's what he grabbed and began to call his own, the good news. And we also talked about how this letter, this gospel written by Mark, believed to be heavily influenced by Peter, if not dictated by Peter, was sent to Rome. That it's most likely the audience is in Rome. The audience is Nero's, under Nero's persecution. Christians are being lit on fire as human torches in his garden. Christians are being fed to the animals, to the wild beasts in the Colosseum. Christians are being persecuted. Christians are in fear. They're probably reading this letter in the dark, in fear. And they're reading it the way we would read the way we would go to a movie, the way that we would interact with something today that just engages us. They're hanging on every word. They're reading this over and over and over again. They're memorizing it. They're reading it so often that they're taking everything into heart. And so we need to just bear in mind that that's where we are. Now, this is the text that we're going to look at today. We're covering a lot of ground. This is the text, and it breaks into 6 segments. So the first segment is Jesus healing a deaf mute in the Decapolis. So we're going to need to remember that, but I'm just going to walk through the map of where we're going. Here's the road map, the deaf mute. And then he feeds 4,000 while still in the area of the Decapolis. And then he is confronted by the Pharisees and asked to give a sign. We're going to talk more about that. The next thing, they're in the boat and they're crossing over, and Jesus talks about the yeast of the Pharisees and of Herod. And this is the third conversation that Jesus has had with his disciples in a boat. And so the conversations are pretty much the same line, but we'll look at that more. And then he heals a blind man. And then we get to this. Who do you say that I am? Jesus asked the question, who am I? Who do people say that I am? Who do you say that I am? And so those are the 6 sections that we're going to look at. But if you saw the sign out there this week, it just said 14 question mark. Well, in the midst of all of this text, there's 14 questions that Jesus asks. Packed in here. In yellow right here is what we find as questions. All of this is questions that Jesus is asking. And here's just a quick look at the questions. How many loaves do you have? This is when he's feeding the 4,000. He wants to know, why does this generation ask for a miraculous sign? This is when he's talking to the Pharisees. Why are you talking about having no bread? This is in the boat. So while he's in the boat, Jesus inundates his disciples with questions. Why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not see or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes but fail to see and ears but fail to hear? And don't you remember? They're still in the boat. These are all of the questions that are being asked in the boat. Then he asks, when I broke the 5 loaves of 5,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? And when I broke the 7 loaves for 4,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? Do you still not understand? Remember when we were talking about his first boat conversation the first boat conversation was when he calms the storm and people were amazed. And Jesus is saying, why were you afraid? The second boat conversation is when he's talking about the bread. It says they had hard hearts and they didn't understand about the loaves. And we all just thought, well, what does he mean about the loaves? And we still don't really have a clear answer. And you know what? Jesus is still harping on this idea of the loaves. All of these questions in the boat about loaves. Why? Do you see anything? This is a question that he asks when he's healing someone who was blind. And then, who do people say I am? But what about you? Who do you say that I am? So all of these questions packed in there like that must mean something. All of those questions in the boat about bread must mean something. We have to dig deeper to find out what's going on here. But what's really interesting about this is that we are at the midpoint in this gospel. And what's very interesting is this. I copied, onto my clipboard the entire Gospel of Mark. If you got real close, or if we had a higher definition projector, from chapter 1, verse 1 to chapter 16, that's what's all there. And then I just went to the middle and I highlighted what Mark has been pointing to and Jesus has been alluding to all along. And it's often what we find in the center of something that the author is trying to convey. This is the most important. And so right smack in the middle of the Gospel of Mark is Peter's answer to Jesus' question, who do you say that I am? And Peter responds, you are the Christ. And that's where we're going today, is that we're finishing this pointing to that statement, because all of what Jesus has been doing with the disciples, it's really interesting because Jesus is teaching everyone, but we really don't hear anything about the content of what Jesus is teaching. It just says that he's teaching. Doesn't tell us about the content, so we're left to look at what Jesus is doing. What is he doing around the Pharisees, and what is he doing with the disciples, and what is he doing with the Gentiles? And because that is the indication of what we have to know the content of what he was teaching. It's not telling us that. But right there in the center, we see that you are the Christ. And everything from chapter 1, all the way to where we are is trying to tell the disciples that he's the Christ. So in the boat, we saw that he passed by, and we saw that that wasn't him just passing by like a casual stroll. He was passing by like when God was revealed to Moses in the mountain. He passed by. And so Jesus is constantly referring and pointing and getting them, don't you understand? Don't you understand? Are you still so dull? Remember that statement. He's asking, do you understand? And they're not getting it. And once we get to here, next time when we start looking at you or the Christ and moving forward, it's Jesus trying to explain to his disciples that this Christ must suffer and die, because they don't get that continuously through the next half. They're not getting that Jesus must die and suffer. They're not getting that. And so right now we're leading up to this whole crescendo of this middle of the gospel where you are the Christ is the center. So let's just kind of walk through some of what's going on here, the deaf mute and the Decapolis. So I'm not going to pick each verse, there's just not enough time, but then Jesus left the vicinity of Tyre and went to Sidon, down the Sea of Galilee, into the region of the Decapolis. And we read that and we just think, okay, so he just went for a stroll. Well, here's where they left off. This is where they are in Tyre, and they go up to Sidon. That's about 20 miles. So Jesus walks with his disciples about 20 miles. Then they would have passed over the river and over to Caesarea Philippi. Most likely they would have passed through there. That's the route that they would have taken. And then they go down to the arrow there on the Sea of Galilee on the eastern side, and that's the Decapolis. Total of about 120 miles of walking, the distance of walking to Boston and back. Boston, from here to Boston and back. And then later they go where Jesus asked the question, who do you say I am? It's back in Caesarea Philippi. So they walk about another 50 miles. So they're walking about 170 miles. That's crazy. We don't think about that. But that's the distance that Jesus is walking. And he's back in this place called the Decapolis. If you remember, we talked a lot about that. That's 10 cities. That's what it stands for. There was a region of 10 cities. And Jesus was last here. He cast out a number of demons. They called themselves Legion because they were many. He cast out all of those demons into pigs, and they told him, leave. So they pushed him out and told him to leave. The person who was demon-possessed and healed wanted to stay with Jesus, and Jesus said, no, stay here. And he said this, tell everyone what the Lord has done for you. And so they come back to the Decapolis, and all of a sudden they're not asking him to leave, but they're bringing him many people who are sick and need to be healed. And so Jesus heals this person who's a deaf mute. It tells us, here's how it goes. So this person is deaf. Jesus takes him aside, and he touches him. And we just saw that he healed a woman, a girl who was demon-possessed from a distance without even saying a word. But here Jesus puts his fingers in the person's ear, and he opens his ears, and then he spits on his hand and touches the person's tongue. Yeah, I mean, next time I'm at a physical, if the doctor takes out the dispenser thing and does this before putting it in my mouth, I'm looking for a new doctor. Well, it wasn't all that less offensive then. You didn't spit on something and then touch somebody's tongue. Why would he do that? It's strange how Jesus heals different people in different ways. He doesn't need to. Maybe it's on the benefit of the person who's deaf. Imagine being deaf and not knowing what's going on, not being able to speak and ask questions. And so Jesus is following some form of routine that perhaps ritual healings were done back then. Not entirely sure, it doesn't tell us. But then he goes on in the same area to feed 4,000 people. So where did he get this massive crowd gathering all of a sudden? Well, it was because he left one person behind and said, tell everyone what the Lord has done for you. And so we find that there's 4,000, and it's worth doing a quick comparison here between the feeding of the 5,000 that's on the left and the feeding of the 4,000 that's on the right. On the left-hand side, Jesus is feeding 5,000 people in the Jewish area. This is a Jewish audience, and he feeds 5,000 people. On the right side of the column, Jesus is feeding 4,000 people, and it's in a Gentile area. This is in the Decapolis. This is in an area where the people, the disciples, are probably not all that comfortable. But there's interesting parallels that's worth pulling out here. Large crowd, large crowd. Compassion. Jesus had compassion on them. It says on the other, I have compassion for these people. It tells us that it was in a remote place. Both of them are saying a remote place. Both of them have some conversation about we need to give them something to eat or send them away, and there's a discussion about feeding them. And so both accounts have that. Both of them talk about how many loaves do you have presently? How many do you have? What are your resources? Both of them ask that question. Both of them have them sit down on the ground. Both of them, there's a thanksgiving. Jesus gives thanks and then gave them to the disciples and the disciples to distribute them. And so the disciples distribute them. And they were both satisfied. Now, we said before, when he healed the woman from Syria, that he said, first feed the children of Israel and let them be satisfied. This same Greek word, Mark only uses it 3 times. Mark is connecting the feeding of the 4,000 to the feeding that we saw before of the 5,000. And so, eating until satisfied, that's there. It's only found in 3 places, here, and these 2 places, and when he's talking to the Syrian woman. Both of them have basketfuls left over. The left side, to the Jewish side, there were 12 baskets. There's a lot of theory out there about why so many baskets and what the numbers are. I don't think it's really worth knowing or figuring that out, other than I would say my own thought is 12 baskets, Jewish ideology, 12 disciples, 12 tribes. 12 is a common number, but when we talk about the Gentiles and those that are over all of God's creation, 7 is a complete number, the 7 days of creation. And so forth. And so 7 baskets and 12. But I don't know that that's anything that I would hang my hat on. They both were satisfied. It looks like I slid back some, sorry. 7 baskets. They fed a large number of people, 5,000 and 4,000. Afterwards, they got in a boat. Afterwards, they had a discussion. And Jesus dismissed the crowd and Jesus sent them away. So there's like these incredible parallels between the feeding of the 4,000 and the feeding of the 5,000. But there's a big difference, though. There's something that's very different about these 2 accounts that I think we need to look at. We looked last week when the Syrian woman came to Jesus to be healed, and we looked at what Matthew said, and Matthew added that the disciples said, "Send her away. She keeps crying. Send her away. Tell her to get lost. We don't need her kind," is really what they were saying, because there was a real prejudice between the people in the Decapolis, the people in Tyre, and the Jewish people. And so what we found there is that Jesus was breaking down the strongholds of prejudice and moving them past it. At least you would think that they would be. But then we look at this. Who is it that comes to the disciples? I'm not sure if you can see that, but in the first feeding, the feeding to the Jewish segment, a day doesn't go by and the disciples come to Jesus and the disciples say, "Hey, it's getting late. We need to send people away. They're getting hungry. They need to go and get some bread." And Jesus says, "Well, how many loaves do you have?" And then they multiply the bread and everything else. But it happens after one day and the disciples come to Jesus and say, "We got a problem here. People are getting hungry." I don't know if you can see what's happening on this side, but it says, during those days, another large crowd gathered. Since they had nothing to eat, Jesus called the disciples and said, "I have compassion for these people. They've already been with me 3 days." What? These people, not the Jewish people, these people have been listening to Jesus' teaching for 3 days, and the disciples are not coming to Jesus saying, "We've got a problem here. People are hungry." Why not? Wouldn't you think after 1 day, after 2 days, surely after 2 days, there'd be a, "Hey, we need to do something about food," but they're not. The disciples, after 3 days, don't even come to Jesus. I think the disciples are like sitting around going, they're either going to die or leave. They're not going to stick around here any longer. They're either going to die or check out. You know, it's almost over. We're not going to have to put up with this much longer. And so Jesus goes to them and says, "I have compassion on these people. It's been 3 days and we don't have anything." And then it enters the discussion, well, how are we going to send them home to buy food and so forth? And Jesus asks the same question: how many loaves do we have? And Jesus performs a miracle, and he feeds 4,000 people with a few loaves and a few fish once again. Interestingly, on the left side, Jesus directed them to all have the people sit down in groups on the grass. So it seems as though he directed the disciples to have them sit down into groups on the green grass. We also did a comparison, if you remember, that the feeding on the left parallels Psalm 23 incredibly. But not going back there, what happens on the other side? He told the crowd to sit down on the ground. Jesus is the one that's telling them, "Hey guys, sit down on the ground, sit down and break it." So Jesus is doing all of the hospitality work. The disciples aren't doing that. Do they still have some amount of prejudice going on? Are they still really not getting it? So they move on from there to the other side. They're back in the Jewish segment on the side of the Galilee. The Pharisees come and they begin to question Jesus to test him, and they're asking for a sign. And Jesus says no sign will be given. In fact, the Greek tells us that what's actually in Greek, he says, "if I give a sign." And it's a format used for cursing, just without the curse. You know, have you ever heard that coming from maybe your parents? "So help me if I have to do this. You know, you're in deep trouble if I end up having to do this." So Jesus is posing it in this if statement without the curse, but it's strong. He's basically saying, you want a sign? It ain't happening. Because the sign that they're looking for is an apocalyptic sign. They want to know that Jesus is the Messiah that's going to kick Rome out. They want to know, just like the disciples do, when is it going to be over where we are in charge and they are not? That's the mentality that both the Pharisees and the disciples have. So Jesus makes this statement about the yeast of the Pharisees in the third boat conversation. And that's worth breaking down, because this is where all those questions were. Then he left them, and he got back into the boat and crossed to the other side. The disciples had forgotten to bring bread, except for one loaf they had with them in the boat. "Be careful," Jesus warned them. "Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod." The Pharisees and Herod had nothing in common. So why is he telling them and lumping them together? Because both of them were more concerned about keeping the position that they currently held than they were with any kind of radical change. They couldn't see the Messiah, they couldn't see the Christ, because they couldn't get past the obstacle of what they would lose. And so Jesus tells them, watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod. And I think he's challenging their prejudice once again. And he's telling them, you gotta let go of these things. And so, aware of their discussion, Jesus asked them, why are you talking about having no bread? Go back one. They discussed this with one another and said, is it because we have no bread? So they're saying, is it because we have no bread? Is that what he's talking about? It's like, hello, McFly, all over again. They don't get it. And so Jesus is saying, I'm aware that you're talking about bread. Why are you talking about having no bread? Do you notice anything funny going on right now? They're talking about having no bread. Matthew, if you look at Matthew's account, says that they had no bread. They forgot to take bread with them. It wasn't that they forgot to take enough bread with them, because that would have been very easy to say. It's saying that they had no bread. But hold on, because Mark tells us in the beginning that they crossed to the other side. The disciples had forgotten to bring bread, except for one loaf that they had with them in the boat. So did they have no bread, or did they have one loaf of bread? Be careful, Jesus warned them, watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod. They discussed this with one another and said, is it because we have no bread? Aware of their discussion, Jesus asked them, why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not see or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes but fail to see and ears but fail to hear? And don't you remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000? How many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? 12, they replied. And when I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? They answered, 7. And he said to them, do you still not understand? Jesus has been on this theme from the first feeding of the 5,000 through this feeding and through this discussion about the bread. Understanding the loaves, and they don't get it, and they don't understand it. Is it possible that Mark is giving a hint to the readers? That comment up in the beginning, except for one loaf that they had with them in the boat, that maybe Mark is alluding that Jesus is the bread? Jesus himself says he is the bread of life in the Gospel of John. And so we've got these two people groups. You know, everybody has probably seen this optical illusion before. Do you see the cup? Do you see the two faces? So what we have is the Pharisees as one face and the disciples as another face, and they both see the flaws in each other, and the Gentiles on one side and the disciples on the other side, or the Jewish people on the other side, and they both see the flaws in each other, but they fail to see the cup of redemption that Jesus is all about. They fail to see the bread of the communion that Jesus is all about. They completely miss that. If they were paying attention, when Jesus healed the person who was deaf and mute, the word that's used for the person who's mute, if you look at the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Jewish scriptures, it's only used once in the Septuagint, and it's only used once in all of the Gospels, and it's right here. So in this section of Mark, I believe Mark is pointing us to Isaiah. And here's what it says in Isaiah. Say to those with fearful hearts, be strong, do not fear. Your God will come. He will come with vengeance, with divine retribution. He will come to save you. And that's what they're looking for. They're looking for the divine retribution, the vengeance, that kind of a Savior. They're looking for that. Jesus is going to spend the next half of the Gospel of Mark explaining why the Messiah had to suffer. Then will the eyes of the blind be opened and the ears of the deaf unstopped. Then the lame leap like a deer, and the mute, that word mute, the mute tongue shout for joy. Mark is making a connection to a prophecy about the end when Christ would come. The way it was explained to me by one of my seminary professors was that there's two events. There's the Messiah who comes and must suffer, and then there's the event of the Messiah that comes with vengeance, with judgment to make things right. And we talked about the gospel in the beginning, that the gospel means good news. The victor has won. He's coming. The death of Christ, he's coming. And we need to align ourselves with him. And then there's that other event where he will establish his reign. And so he's reigning right now, but the realization of it is coming and will be realized. And so there's two events. But what they often saw was if I were to hold my hand directly in line with you, you would see one event, not the distance between the two events. And that's what's happening here, is that they have interpreted the scriptures as a Messiah who is coming that fixes everything and makes things right, and they're not seeing the many scriptures that reveal that Jesus must suffer and must die, that the Messiah is a suffering servant, as we can look at in Isaiah as well. Isaiah reveals this in chapter 53 really strongly. And so here's the thing that I want to just challenge us with as we're starting to wrap things up. What's the difference between the Pharisees and the disciples? What's the difference between the Gentiles, the non-Jewish people, and the disciples? They both, all of them, none of them get it. They don't get it. It's going over their heads. They should be seeing everything. I mean, and we look at it and we read it and we go, why don't they get it? If somebody multiplied thousands of loaves of bread to feed thousands of people, that would get your attention. Surely you'd believe if that happened. You know, if somebody walked on water right in front of you, surely that would get your attention. If somebody calmed the storms of the sea, surely that would get your attention. If somebody raised someone from the dead, sure, that would get your attention. And all of these things they saw or they had, people were talking about it and they didn't get it. But I guarantee you, if we were to take a pad of paper and start listing out the things that God has done, we might find that we're not getting it as well. That things just happen and go over our heads. And Jesus has a real problem with the direction. That's the issue. What direction are you going? The disciples are in a direction of wanting to know more, of trusting Jesus, of following Jesus, even though they don't understand. The disciples are moving in the direction of, we're going in this direction. He's done enough for us to be wanting to follow him. The Pharisees are moving in the opposite direction. Many of the Gentiles, Herod, is moving in the opposite direction. So what direction are you moving in your life? That's the big question. Are you certain of everything about Jesus? Are you? Help me out, because I'm not. You know, I know certain things. I know that he was God incarnate. I know that he died for my sins. I know that he's coming back for me. I know certain things, but man, I'm still discovering stuff. I'm still getting to know him every day. But I want to. I'm following. I'm moving in that direction. But if you're challenging Jesus in a sarcastic way, if you're challenging Jesus in a non-thoughtful way, if you're challenging Jesus if you have contempt for him, well, then the king is coming. He's establishing his throne, and his announcement is good news for those who align themselves with him. And there's consequences for those that don't. Herod was siding with Mark Antony, and when Augustus took over, Herod quickly aligned with Augustus. That's the good news. He heard the good news, and he made amends. That's what Jesus is saying. You know, what direction are you in? Because if you're in the direction of the disciples, he has patience for you. I think about how they didn't get it, and then they didn't get it, and then they just didn't get it, and he still sticks with them. I find great comfort in that. But woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, the people who don't get it and are moving in the wrong direction. Wrapping things up, the blind man is healed. So here, Jesus heals a blind man. Again, he takes him to the side, and he spits again. Like, really? I want to get in the line of the healing without the spitting. Are you spitting today? I might want to say no thanks. But he heals someone who's blind, and he does it kind of in an offensive, uncomfortable way, just like the mute that we saw at the beginning. And here's the thing. Here's how this unfolds. If you read that, Jesus spits and puts his hands on his eyes, and the guy begins to see. He just begins to see. He spit on the man's eyes, and he put his hands on him. And Jesus asked, do you see anything? He looked and he said, I see people. They look like trees walking around. Really? Did Jesus not have enough juice that morning? He just cast a demon out of somebody from a distance without a word. That's what we saw last week. He's raised someone from the dead. Does he need a two-step process to free someone from blindness? So why is he? Maybe it has something to do with what happens next. Who do you say that I am? Jesus and his disciples went to the villages around Caesarea Philippi. On the way there, they asked, who do people say that I am? They replied, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others, one of the prophets. Same exact thing that Herod's group of people in Herod's courts were saying about Jesus that we saw earlier. Same order. And Jesus said, but what about you? Who do you say that I am? And Peter answered, you are the Christ. Do you know that Mark uses the word Christ 7 times only? You would think he'd use Christos more. This is only the 2nd time that he uses the word Christ. Only the 2nd time, and he's at the middle of the entire gospel. 2nd time using the word Christ. The first is in chapter 1, verse 1, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And when we looked at that, we said that was most likely a title. And so it's in the title. The readers see it in the title. They know what's coming. They know that Jesus is the Christ. And by the time they get to this and Peter says, you are the Christ, probably the audience listening goes, yes, he finally gets it. Does that have something to do, though, with the person who was blind? This 2-step process, this opening up of the ears of the deaf, the mute, this connecting to Isaiah, this 2-step process of healing someone that's blind, does it have something to do with anything? Maybe Peter, making this profession, is finally able to see. But it still looks like men that look like trees walking. He still has a blurred vision. And maybe Jesus is taking them aside, just like he took the disciples aside. He takes the mute person aside. He takes the blind person aside. And he does something to them that enables them to see, to hear, to speak. That's what I think is going on here. Because they didn't get it. They weren't getting it. They couldn't get it. The Pharisees didn't get it, aren't getting it, won't get it. Why is it that Peter gets it? Now, we'll talk more on that as we look at this the next time, but Matthew reveals this. Jesus says, flesh and blood did not reveal this to you, Peter. This is a revelation from God. you have been illuminated. Illuminated. You know, one of my favorite movies is a chick flick. Nicholas Sparks wrote a book called The Notebook. They made it into a movie. James Garner is here in this movie. It is an outstanding movie because it's the gospel. Amazingly, it's the gospel. So here's how the story just unfolds. The character reading the book, his name is Noah. The person next to him is his wife. She has dementia. She doesn't remember who she is. She doesn't remember the love relationship that she had with Noah. The book that Noah is holding is the story of their love relationship, how they met, how they struggled, how they became husband and wife. It's the story of their lives. And so as you start to watch this movie, he's reading this story, but we, watching it the first time, you don't know, that they're husband and wife. He's just a guy in a nursing home. Later in the movie, the guys, his kids, their kids come and they're talking to him, and she doesn't know her own kids. She's being introduced to them for the first time, and she leaves. And the kids are talking to Noah, to James Garner's character, Noah. And the kids are saying, "Dad, you don't have to stay here. You don't have to live in this nursing home. Come and live with us. Stop the madness. She doesn't know who you are. Don't keep putting yourself through this. Don't do that." And he's saying, "My place is right here with Allie." He won't leave. And so he sits with her patiently and he reads this story, hoping that the words of their relationship would reconnect and somehow spark a memory that allows her to come out of it. And so we find that happens. That somehow reading this book, this love story to his lover, generates some kind of synapses in the brain that allows her to remember who she is. She has dementia. I wonder if that's what happened with Peter. He had some kind of spiritual dementia and living with Christ and seeing what he was doing. I wonder if the readers being persecuted by Rome have spiritual dementia, that they're starting to doubt who they are and where they belong and what is God's story and what is his plan and purpose. And they're reading a book written by the author of life, and something happens and stirs within them. And the people in Rome under persecution suddenly have hope, and they begin spreading this gospel message, this good news to other people and moving forward with it. Maybe that happened to me. It did. Something happened inside of me where spiritually I had spiritual dementia, and something happened, and I'm still seeing men like trees. I don't see everything completely clearly, but it's being more focused each day that I continue on in the right direction. So our challenge today is, can we recognize our spiritual dementia? Can we trust the person who's reading the book, who's giving the story to us, who's written the book for us? Can we trust that person to help us decipher and see more clearly? Because they didn't get it without the Spirit's illumination. We won't get it without some form of illumination. And it comes, just like in this movie, from a book, from a spoken word. Because in the end, it's all about you are the Christ. We've spent 17 weeks of Jesus moving the disciples to the place where they could recognize that. But they're still not there. And neither are we. But we're in the boat. together. Let's pray. Father, thank you for speaking into our hearts. Lord, I pray for those that may be not really moving in any direction right now. I pray that you and your Spirit would illuminate, that you would heal our blindness, that you would cure our deafness and our inability to speak, that we would go forth understanding the good news and proclaiming it to others, that you are the victor of death, that you are coming to establish in completeness your reign, and that we need to proclaim the good news. Lord, as we go forward this week, may we dance and sing this good news. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.